Rome didn't collapse because enemies were stronger, it collapsed because the system stopped feeling worth saving to the people inside it. That lesson hits hard in every era, especially modern ones. What makes Rome unforgettable is that it experienced everything: rise, dominance, peace, excess, decay, collapse, and legacy. Most civilizations only get a few of those stages. Rome ran the full cycle, which is why it feels so complete as a story and so relevant as a lesson. It's not just about what Rome did, it's about what humans do when given power over time. So when you zoom all the way out, Rome isn't really gone. It's in the laws people follow, the cities people live in, the governments people argue about, and the words people speak. Rome lost its armies but won the long game. It turned itself into an idea so strong that even failure couldn't kill it. This is where the Roman story jumps straight into the modern world, because now we're talking Rome versus modern superpowers, real comparison, real lessons, real parallels that feel way too familiar. This part hits hard because once you line Rome up next to modern nations, you start realizing history doesn't repeat exactly, but it definitely rhymes, and Rome wrote the first verse everyone else keeps remixing. Rome was the first society to really figure out how to project power far beyond its borders using roads, law, military presence, culture, and money all working together, and modern superpowers still use that same playbook, just with different tech and faster communication. Rome controlled territory through infrastructure more than fear alone, and that's something modern states copied perfectly. Roman roads weren't just for travel, they were for control, letting armies move fast, messages travel reliably, and trade stay steady. Today, highways, railways, shipping lanes, and digital networks do the same job. Whoever controls movement controls power, and Rome understood that before anyone else did. Modern superpowers don't need legions marching in armor, but they still rely on bases, logistics, and supply chains the same way Rome relied on forts and roads. The tech changed, but the strategy stayed the same. It started as a republic built on ideals, checks, and shared power, then slowly drifted towards central authority as crises stacked up. Every emergency made people more willing to trade freedom for stability, and over time that shift became permanent. Modern nations do this too, expanding executive power during wars, economic crashes, or security threats, always saying it's temporary, always promising balance will return later. Rome shows how later doesn't always come, because once power concentrates, it rarely gives itself back without pressure. Militarily, Rome and modern superpowers share the same challenge: maintaining dominance without exhausting themselves. Rome stationed soldiers across massive borders, stretching resources thin, while modern powers maintain bases, alliances, and influence across the globe. The cost isn't just money, it's attention, political focus, and public patience. Rome learned the hard way that winning battles doesn't matter if the home front loses faith. Modern societies face that same tension when long conflicts drag on and people start asking what the point even is anymore. Economically, Rome's reliance on constant expansion has a modern parallel in growth-based systems that assume progress will always continue. Rome's economy thrived when conquest brought in resources, labor, and wealth, but once expansion slowed, the system struggled to adjust. Modern economies that depend heavily on growth, consumption, and global dominance face similar pressure when growth slows or systems get disrupted. Inflation, inequality, and public frustration aren't new problems. Rome dealt with them first, just without spreadsheets and news cycles. Culturally, Rome mastered soft power before the term even existed. Roman language, law, fashion, architecture, and lifestyle spread across the empire, making people want to be Roman, not just obey Rome. Modern superpowers do this through media, culture, brands, and values, shaping global tastes and expectations. When people adopt your culture voluntarily, control becomes easier and resistance weakens. Rome understood that winning hearts could be just as effective as winning wars. One of the biggest parallels is how both Rome and modern powers deal with outsiders. Rome constantly absorbed new peoples, soldiers, workers, and cultures, and at its best, it turned diversity into strength. At its worst, it failed to integrate people fairly, creating resentment and instability. Modern societies wrestle with the same issue, balancing inclusion, identity, and loyalty in increasingly diverse populations. Rome proves that diversity isn't the problem, poor management of diversity is. The final similarity is psychological. Rome believed it was eternal, destined, chosen by fate or gods to rule forever. That belief created confidence, unity, and momentum, but it also created blindness. Warnings were ignored, reforms delayed, and critics dismissed because Rome always survives. Modern superpowers often carry the same mindset, assuming collapse happens to others, not them. Rome stands as proof that no system is immune to time, pressure, and internal decay. No matter how powerful it looks from the outside, Rome still matters. This is the answer. Rome isn't just ancient history, it's the first full test run of global power. Every empire after it has been a variation on the Roman model, learning from its successes and repeating its mistakes. Studying Rome isn't about nostalgia. It's about understanding how power actually works when it scales up to dominate the world. When you really sit with it, Rome wasn't just the first superpower, it was the first society to realize that raw force alone doesn't hold an empire together for centuries. Rome used power, but it also used incentives, identity, and opportunity, and that mix is exactly what modern superpowers still rely on. Rome didn't just conquer people and walk away, it stayed, built cities, laid roads, set up courts, and slowly rewired daily life so that being part of Rome felt normal, even beneficial. Modern states do the same thing through institutions, economic systems, global trade, and cultural influence, creating networks that make breaking away feel more dangerous than staying in. One thing Rome nailed early was citizenship as a tool. Being Roman wasn't always about blood, it was about status. Over time, Rome expanded citizenship to allies, soldiers, and entire provinces, turning outsiders into stakeholders. That move reduced rebellion and increased loyalty, because once people had something to lose, they were more likely to protect the system. Modern nations do this through legal status, economic opportunity, and political inclusion, but when those systems stall or feel unfair, resentment grows fast. Rome shows that inclusion works best when it's real, not symbolic, and when people feel the system actually delivers. Propaganda was another Roman specialty, even if they didn't call it that. Emperors filled cities with statues, monuments, coins, and public messages reminding everyone who was in charge and why that rule was good for the people. Victories were exaggerated, defeats were hidden, and leadership was framed as destiny. Modern governments use media, branding, and messaging the same way, shaping narratives to maintain confidence and control. Rome teaches that perception is power, but it also warns that when reality drifts too far from the message, trust collapses hard. Rome also struggled with something every superpower faces: scale. What works in one city doesn't always work across continents. Laws that made sense in Italy didn't always fit distant provinces, and enforcing uniform control became harder as the empire grew. Modern states face this with globalization, regional inequality, and uneven development. Rome's mistake wasn't expanding, it was failing to adapt systems fast enough to match that expansion. Big systems need flexibility, and Rome slowly lost that. Another uncomfortable parallel is elite behavior. Roman elites increasingly lived disconnected from everyday reality, insulated by wealth, privilege, and power. They debated tradition while ignoring suffering, protected their assets while demanding sacrifice from others, and underestimated how much resentment was building below them. Modern societies see similar patterns when inequality grows and leadership feels distant. Rome proves that when elites stop feeling accountable, systems rot from the inside long before enemies show up at the gate. Militarily, Rome's reliance on professionals changed everything. Early Roman soldiers fought for the state, later ones fought for pay. That shift didn't make them weaker fighters, but it changed loyalty. Modern militaries are professional too, and while that brings efficiency, it also creates distance between civilians and the cost of war. Rome reminds us that when most people don't feel directly connected to defense, political decisions about conflict get easier, and sometimes more reckless. There's also the mental fatigue factor. Rome existed for so long that people forgot what life without it even looked like, and when it started failing, many didn't know how to respond. Modern systems feel the same way: deeply embedded, unavoidable, permanent. Rome shows that permanence is an illusion. Systems last because people maintain them, believe in them, and adapt them. When belief fades, collapse doesn't need a single dramatic moment. It just needs time. The scariest parallel is confidence. Rome believed it was chosen, exceptional, and destined to rule. That belief powered centuries of success, but it also blinded leaders to warning signs. Critics were dismissed, reforms delayed, and problems explained away because Rome had always survived before. Modern superpowers carry the same confidence, often assuming history bends in their favor. Rome stands as proof that confidence without humility is dangerous. And this is where Rome stops being a story and turns into a manual, because these are the real lessons Rome teaches the modern world. No sugarcoating, no movie nonsense, just straight truths written in stone and blood. This part matters the most, because Rome didn't just rise and fall for entertainment. It left warnings for anyone powerful enough to listen. The first lesson Rome teaches is that systems matter more than heroes. Rome had legendary generals, brilliant leaders, and powerful emperors, but none of them could save the empire once the system itself started breaking down. Early Rome worked because rules were stronger than individuals, offices were temporary, and accountability existed, even if imperfect. Once power stopped rotating and started sticking to individuals, corruption became normal and repair became impossible. Modern societies love strong personalities, but Rome proves that when institutions weaken, no hero lasts long enough to fix everything. Another brutal lesson is that inequality kills loyalty. Rome didn't fall when it was poor, it fell when wealth piled up at the top and everyday people stopped seeing the system as fair. Small farmers lost land, elites of Once people feel the system only works for a few, they stop defending it. Modern nations struggle with this exact issue, and Rome shows that ignoring inequality isn't just immoral, it's unstable. Rome also teaches that expansion without reform is a trap. As long as Rome kept conquering, problems stayed hidden because new land, money, and labor kept flowing in. But once expansion slowed, the weaknesses were exposed. The economy, military, and government were all built for growth, not sustainability. Modern systems that rely on endless growth face the same risk. Rome proves that growth can delay collapse, but it can't prevent it forever. Another major lesson is about military loyalty. Early Roman soldiers fought for the state, later ones fought for pay and commanders. That shift changed everything. Armies became political tools, civil wars increased, and emperors rose and fell based on military support. Rome shows that when force becomes disconnected from shared civic identity, stability disappears. Power backed only by force doesn't last without trust. Rome also teaches the danger of normalizing corruption. Corruption didn't shock Romans anymore by the end. It became expected. Offices were bought, favors were traded, and accountability vanished. Once corruption feels normal, people stop believing reform is possible. Modern societies face the same risk when scandals stop surprising anyone. Rome proves that corruption doesn't need to explode to destroy a system, it just needs time. There's a powerful lesson in civic apathy too. Early Romans believed participation mattered. Later generations felt powerless and disconnected. When people stop voting, stop engaging, and stop caring, systems hollow out fast. Collapse overnight, it's slowly emptied from the inside. Modern democracies should pay attention, because apathy is quieter than rebellion but just as dangerous. Rome also warns about identity confusion. At its best, Rome integrated different cultures and turned diversity into strength. At its worst, it failed to create a shared sense of belonging, leaving people unsure why they should stay loyal. Modern societies face the same challenge. Rome shows that diversity works when people feel included and protected by the system, not ignored or exploited. Another lesson is that belief keeps systems alive. Rome survived invasions, disasters, and civil wars when people still believed in it. Once belief faded, even strong walls and armies couldn't save it. Systems don't collapse when enemies arrive. They collapse when people inside stop believing they're worth saving. That's one of the coldest truths Rome leaves behind. Finally, Rome teaches humility. Romans believed their empire was eternal, chosen, and unstoppable. That belief powered greatness, but it also blinded them to warning signs. Rome proves that no power is permanent, no system is immune, and no success guarantees survival. Adaptation, accountability, and reform are the real keys to longevity. So Part 8 isn't about fear, it's about awareness. Rome isn't a prophecy, it's a lesson. It shows what humans can build, what they can break, and what happens when power outgrows responsibility. If modern societies want to last, Rome already showed the roadmap and the dead ends. By the time the late Republic rolled around, Rome had become this massive power machine, but the machine started rattling hard because the old rules weren't keeping up. Generals like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla figured out something the Senate didn't fully get. Soldiers weren't loyal to the state anymore, they were loyal to whoever paid them, fed them, and promised them land. This was a total game changer. Suddenly, the army became a political weapon, not just a fighting force. Marius reorganized the legions, letting poor men enlist even if they didn't own land, which was genius on one hand, because it filled the ranks, but on the other hand, it made the army dependent on him personally. That meant generals could march their soldiers into Rome itself and basically say, "Do what I want or deal with my army." And trust me, when your army is battle-hardened and hungry, you don't just say no. Sulla took this concept to the extreme. He literally marched on Rome with his army, kicked out whoever opposed him, and declared himself dictator. This wasn't just power grabs, it was a warning shot for the Republic. The system that was supposed to prevent one man from having too much control was failing because the people who enforced the law, the soldiers, were now loyal to individuals, not ideals. Civil war became normal, political murder became normal, and the Senate lost control. If you were a citizen hoping for stability, it felt like riding a roller coaster with no brakes. And this wasn't just about generals being greedy. It was also about class tension. Land was disappearing from small farmers, elites were stacking wealth, and the urban poor were swelling in the city, depending on grain doles and handouts. Politicians realized that if they could promise land or benefits to the soldiers, they could turn military power into political power. That's exactly what Marius and Sulla did, and the Republic never fully recovered from that shift. The old balance, checks, vetoes, and elected offices broke under the weight of ambition backed by armed men. Meanwhile, Rome's enemies weren't standing still. Hannibal had already proven centuries earlier that a clever general could scare Rome badly, and now internal civil wars were weakening the Republic from inside. Borders needed defending, taxes needed collecting, and the Senate was too busy fighting itself to handle real threats. It's wild to think about. Rome was powerful enough to conquer almost the entire known world, but it almost collapsed because of internal loyalty shifts and political ambition. That's a lesson even modern governments ignore at their peril. A system can look invincible, but internal cracks can destroy it faster than any external enemy. By the time the dust settled, one thing was clear. Strongmen had learned the rules of the game better than the institutions. Loyalty, force, and money had become the real currency of power, not tradition, votes, or law. And once the precedent was set, armies marching on the city to enforce personal will, the Republic was doomed. Every ambitious leader afterward could see the path. Control the army, control the city, control the state. Civil wars weren't mistakes anymore, they were tools for career advancement, and Rome spiraled faster toward dictatorship than most people expected. That's Part 9, showing how the late Republic cracked under army loyalty, ambition, and inequality, setting the stage for Julius Caesar and the end of democracy in Rome. Next up is Part 10, which is all about Julius Caesar. The man who changed everything, his rise, popularity, assassination, and why killing him didn't save the Republic. Julius Caesar wasn't just another ambitious Roman, he was a game changer, the guy who made the Republic look like it was running on fumes while he rewrote the playbook. Caesar was smart, ruthless, and crazy popular with the people, which made the Senate nervous as hell. He came from the patrician class, but he knew the real power wasn't just in family name. It was in the streets, the army, and the people's support. He understood early that armies weren't just tools for conquest, they were political weapons, and he used that lesson better than anyone before him. When he marched his army across the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, he didn't just start a war, He broke a centuries-old rule. That act was basically him saying, "No going back. I'm taking Rome my way." And everyone knew it. There was no subtlety, no hiding behind law or tradition. Once Caesar made his move, the Republic's fate was sealed. Caesar's popularity with the people came from more than just charisma. He was a showman, a reformer, and a general who brought home wins and loot. He redistributed land, paid off debts, gave bonuses to veterans, and threw parades like nobody else. Ordinary Romans loved him, and armies loved him because he rewarded loyalty with tangible benefits. That created a loyalty loop. Soldiers followed him personally, citizens cheered for him publicly, and the Senate's authority slowly became meaningless. Law and tradition were no longer enough to contain a man who had both the army and the people on his side. That's the kind of imbalance that kills republics, and Caesar understood it better than anyone. But with all that power, Caesar also had enemies. The Senate was full of guys who saw him as a threat to their own influence, their wealth, and the old Republican ideals, or at least the illusion of them. Even though Caesar acted like a man of the people, the elites feared his growing dominance. So on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, a group of senators stabbed him to death. Brutal? Absolutely. Dramatic? You bet. But here's the kicker. Killing Caesar didn't save the Republic. Instead of restoring balance, it threw Rome into chaos, sparking civil wars that eventually cleared the path for the empire. That's the irony. The people who thought murdering one guy would fix the system ended up accelerating the Republic's death. Caesar's story teaches some heavy lessons. First, popularity can rival law as a source of power. Second, armies loyal to individuals instead of institutions are dangerous. Third, reforms and generosity can boost power if wielded strategically, but they can also destabilize old systems. And finally, eliminating one figurehead never fixes a broken system. It just leaves a vacuum that someone else will fill, often with more force and fewer restraints. Rome was already tired of the Republic, and Caesar was the spark that lit the fuse. After Caesar's death, the stage was set for Octavian, Augustus, and the transformation of Rome from republic to empire. Caesar's rise, rule, and assassination didn't just end with him. It created centuries of precedent about power, loyalty, and how fragile political systems really are. The Republic's ideals had been crushed under the weight of ambition, popularity, and the unstoppable logic of personal loyalty over civic duty. And honestly, that's a story that modern leaders still ignore at their peril. After Julius Caesar's assassination, Rome didn't suddenly calm down. Nah, it exploded into full-blown chaos, like a city on fire with no firefighters in sight. Civil wars erupted everywhere because no one knew who should actually run things. Senators, generals, and politicians all scrambled to grab power, while the people tried to cling to whatever sense of normal life remained. The Republic's institutions were already fragile, and Caesar's death proved just how little they could protect themselves. The illusion of a balanced government was gone, and everyone was left guessing who would survive, who would die, and who would ultimately wear the crown. Out of the chaos, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, emerged. The guy was smart, patient, and ruthless in ways that nobody fully realized at first. He didn't just muscle his way into power, he played the long game. He built alliances, manipulated public opinion, and carefully eliminated rivals without making himself look like a dictator, at least not right away. Meanwhile, Mark Antony and Cleopatra tried to claim power in the East, creating another layer of tension. Rome was split between competing armies, political factions, and a population that had grown tired of war but had no control over it. It was basically a three-way chess game with swords and legions instead of pawns. Civil wars raged on, and Rome itself became a battlefield. Streets that once buzzed with markets and civic life were now filled with marching armies, rumors of betrayals, and the fear that anyone could be a target at any moment. Ordinary Romans had to adapt fast. Either pick a side, hide, or try to survive. The old republic promised stability and justice, but by this point, those promises had crumbled. The Senate still met, laws were still passed, but they were powerless against military might and political cunning. The game had changed, and the old rules didn't apply anymore. Eventually, Octavian came out on top. He didn't just win because he was stronger. He won because he played the political long game. He consolidated power, neutralized rivals like Antony, and returned Rome to a sense of order, but order under his control. The citizens got peace, the army got pay, and Rome got an emperor who kept the illusion of the republic alive while holding all real power. This was genius-level strategy. Give people what they want: safety, entertainment, prosperity, while quietly bending the system to serve yourself. That's how the republic officially died. Not with a dramatic coup, but with a subtle shift where all authority centralized in one man. The transition shows how systems fail when institutions lose legitimacy. The Senate and consuls weren't weak on paper. They were irrelevant in practice because no one outside of the elite respected them anymore. Power flowed to whoever controlled armies, resources, and public opinion. Octavian understood this, and that's Augustus wasn't just a ruler. He was a master of perception. He made sure Rome looked like a republic on the surface. The Senate still met, magistrates still held titles, laws were still passed, but everyone knew who was really calling the shots. Peace returned to the streets, the grain dole kept the urban poor fed, and veterans got land. The people were happy enough to cheer, the army was loyal enough to enforce his will, and the elites were either co-opted or too scared to rebel. Augustus basically invented the blueprint for empire. Control everything quietly while letting everyone think they have a say. That's how Rome transformed from a messy, chaotic republic into a smooth-running empire that lasted centuries. He also rewrote history and culture to his advantage. Monuments, statues, coins, and public buildings constantly reminded people of his power, his victories, and his supposed dedication to Rome. Every triumph parade, every carefully worded law, every festival was propaganda in action. Augustus wasn't just a politician or general. He was a showman of authority, making sure that even if people disagreed with him, they couldn't ignore him. That's a lesson that's echoed in every empire and superpower that came after. Winning hearts is as powerful as winning battles. The army stayed loyal because Augustus understood incentives better than anyone. Pay, land, recognition, and career opportunities kept soldiers on his side, and loyalty to him personally became more important than loyalty to abstract ideas. That was dangerous in theory, but in practice it kept the empire stable for decades. Augustus proved that an empire could survive not because everyone agreed, but because everyone felt they had something to gain by supporting the system, even if that system was really just one man's vision. Culturally, Augustus kickstarted a Roman identity that lasted. Laws were codified, citizenship expanded, roads and cities were built, and Rome became a place where Roman culture dominated while local identities were absorbed and reshaped. He didn't just win power, he reshaped Rome itself, making it clear that the empire wasn't a passing experiment, but a permanent institution. From architecture to festivals, from government to religion, Augustus' influence set the stage for the next 200 years of Roman dominance. By the time he died, Augustus had done something almost magical. He had created the illusion of democracy, the reality of monarchy, and a system that would keep Rome stable long after him. The empire became more than a state. It became an idea, a culture, and a structure that would influence the world for centuries. The lessons are clear: perception, control, loyalty, and culture matter just as much as armies and borders. Augustus didn't just take power, he engineered it for longevity. When Augustus stepped onto the scene, he didn't just take power, he reinvented what Rome was. The streets were quiet after decades of chaos, but the people wanted more than just peace. They wanted stability, security, and pride. Augustus gave them all that, but he also made sure that he got all the credit without looking like a tyrant. That's the genius of his reign. He understood the illusion of democracy better than anyone. The Senate still existed, consuls still held office, and laws still got passed, but real power flowed through him. Citizens cheered, soldiers followed loyally, and elites learned it was smarter to cooperate than resist. In every sense, Augustus didn't just rule Rome, he re-engineered Rome itself. Propaganda became his secret weapon. Coins showed him as youthful, divine, and victorious. Monuments and statues celebrated his achievements and framed him as the savior of the Republic. even though he was technically ending it. Every triumph parade, festival, and public speech reinforced the narrative. Rome was great because Augustus was guiding it. He made the people believe that his power was natural, necessary, and for their benefit, which is why the early empire stayed stable while other empires around the world collapsed under less careful leadership. Augustus knew that controlling perception was just as important as controlling armies. The military stayed loyal because Augustus knew how to pay attention to incentives. Soldiers got land, bonuses, and status, and veterans became part of a network of loyalty that tied personal success to his rule. This wasn't bribery. It was strategic management of human ambition. Armies that once threatened the Republic were now the backbone of the empire, and their loyalty ensured decades of peace, conquest, and growth. Augustus' model of keeping the army satisfied while maintaining civilian obedience became the template for every emperor after him. Administration under Augustus was revolutionary. He streamlined governance, reorganized provinces, improved tax collection, and codified laws. Roads, aqueducts, and cities were expanded, making Rome not just a political capital but a cultural and economic hub. Citizenship was extended, and Roman law spread across conquered territories, blending local customs with imperial structure. This created a sense of shared identity that helped stabilize the empire for generations. People felt like Romans even if they were far from the city itself, and that loyalty was priceless. Culturally, Augustus' reign set the tone for what it meant to be Roman. Religion was used to legitimize authority. Temples were rebuilt, rituals of Roman greatness, unity, and obedience. Virgil, Horace, and Ovid wrote works celebrating Rome's destiny, linking Augustus to mythic heroes and reinforcing the narrative that the empire wasn't just politics. It was history in motion, guided by him. By the end of his reign, Augustus had done something almost unbelievable. He had created a system where Rome could function without constant chaos, where citizens felt represented, soldiers stayed loyal, and power was centralized in a way that no one dared challenge openly. The Republic's ideals were gone, but the people barely noticed because they were enjoying safety, prosperity, and pride in being Roman. Augustus didn't just take power, he engineered longevity, turning Rome into an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean and shape the world for centuries. Life in the Roman Empire wasn't all marble statues and grand parades. For most people, it was a mix of hustle, survival, and street-level chaos. The city of Rome alone was massive, crowded, and loud, filled with merchants shouting in the forum, kids running between buildings, and citizens trying to make a living any way they could. Poorer Romans lived in insulae, which were basically ancient apartment blocks stacked on top of each other, often cramped, smelly, and fire-prone. The streets were messy. Garbage, animals, and vendors all jostling for space. And plumbing, though advanced in some ways, couldn't keep up with the population. But even with all that, people loved the city because it was the heart of the world, and being Roman carried a sense of pride that made daily struggles feel worth it. Food and entertainment defined life for many Romans. The wealthy dined on exotic meats, wine, and feasts that lasted hours, while ordinary citizens relied on bread, porridge, and the famous grain dole, which the government distributed to keep people from rioting. Festivals, public games, and gladiator fights were like modern sports and reality TV combined. Everyone could attend, everyone could gossip, and the excitement was nonstop. These events weren't just fun. They were tools of social control. Emperors like Augustus made sure citizens were distracted, entertained, and loyal, because a happy crowd is a quiet crowd. Work was brutal for most, especially outside the elite classes. Farmers, artisans, and laborers spent long days producing food, goods, and infrastructure that kept the empire running. Slaves and freedmen made up a huge portion of the workforce, doing everything from household chores to construction, sometimes under harsh conditions. Wealthy citizens could hire labor, sit in forums, and debate politics, but the average person had little downtime beyond public events, gossip, and family duties. That said, Romans valued community, family ties, and local connections, and those social networks helped people survive tough times. Religion was another cornerstone of daily life. Temples, sacrifices, Festivals and rituals weren't just spiritual, they were social glue. Public religion reinforced civic identity, loyalty to the state, and cultural unity, reminding people that being Roman wasn't just about geography. It was a mindset. Even ordinary rituals, like household offerings or participation in festivals, created a sense of belonging and continuity. Religion also tied directly into politics, giving emperors legitimacy while keeping citizens engaged in the empire's ideology. Education and literacy mattered, but mostly for the elite. Wealthy kids learned reading, writing, rhetoric, and Greek culture, preparing them for political or military careers. Most ordinary Romans were literate enough to read basic signs, contracts, or announcements, but life demanded practical skills more than book smarts. Apprenticeships, trades, and family businesses taught survival, while the state and local community provided support where it could. Even travel and infrastructure shaped daily life. Roads, aqueducts, and bridges made commerce faster, armies mobile, and cities connected. Markets thrived because merchants could bring in goods from across the empire: olive oil from Hispania, wine from Gaul, grain from Egypt, making daily life richer than most people imagine. Rome wasn't just a city. It was a hub in a massive, interconnected system, and even ordinary people felt its reach. So daily life in Rome was messy, lively, and layered. There was chaos, yes, but also opportunity, entertainment, and identity. Citizens worked, ate, worshipped, celebrated, and survived in a system that was powerful, structured, and sometimes brutal. Life under the empire gave people pride, security, and spectacle. And that combination helped the empire endure for centuries, even as it concentrated wealth, power, and culture at the top. By the time the empire was cruising at full speed, being an emperor wasn't just about power, it was about survival, image, and sometimes straight-up insanity. Some emperors were brilliant, disciplined, and strategic, but others? Man, they were wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. Take Caligula, for example. The guy started off promising but quickly earned a reputation for excess, cruelty, and bizarre behavior. Some stories say he made his horse a priest, flaunted wealth like it was infinite, and executed people on whims. Whether every detail is true or not, the point is clear. Absolute power can mess with your mind when there's no accountability. The Senate couldn't stop him, the people were terrified, and even loyal soldiers had to tread carefully. It was a system that bred extremes, and Rome saw plenty of them. Then you got Nero, another emperor who took self-indulgence and disaster management to a new level. He fancied himself an artist, playing music while Rome burned. Though historians debate how literal that is, the story stuck because it captured the essence of a ruler disconnected from reality. Nero's reign shows what happens when ego meets unchecked authority. He executed rivals, ignored crises, and manipulated perception to stay in power. Citizens tolerated it for a while because he provided bread, games, and spectacle. It has limits when people start fearing their own emperor. Not every emperor was mad, though. People like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius ruled wisely, balancing power with governance, military strategy, and public welfare. They knew that absolute authority came with responsibility, and they used it to stabilize borders, improve infrastructure, and promote Roman law and culture. These guys prove that while power can corrupt, it can also be used to build lasting legacies when tempered with discipline and vision. The real takeaway from this period is that absolute power exposes human extremes. Without accountability, systems become reflections of whoever sits at the top. Ambition, paranoia, cruelty, or brilliance can shape the entire empire. Rome survived for centuries not because emperors were perfect, but because the structure allowed some checks: the Senate, advisors, military loyalty, even if they were mostly symbolic. Still, those symbols mattered enough to prevent constant collapse, at least until a truly terrible combination of incompetence and instability hit. Rome's emperors also illustrate how public perception is power. Caligula and Nero could push limits because the people and army tolerated them while they got benefits, games, bread, monuments. Trajan and Hadrian stayed popular because they balanced spectacle with good governance. In other words, absolute power worked only if the ruler could manage perception, control loyalty, and deliver tangible results. Fail at any of those and rebellion, assassination, or civil war followed. By the end of this wild era, Rome had learned the hard way that human nature and absolute authority are a dangerous combo. The empire could survive chaos, plague, and invasion, but the personality at the top could accelerate disaster or prolong prosperity. History remembers the insane rulers for drama, the wise rulers for stability, and the system itself for somehow enduring centuries of both. It's a lesson modern powers still wrestle with. Absolute control is intoxicating, but it's also unpredictable, and it only lasts as long as the people, the army, and the structure allow. By the time the empire hit its peak, Rome was basically flexing on the entire known world. Borders stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia, and the empire controlled millions of people, armies, and resources like a well-oiled machine. It was the ultimate combination of military might, political savvy, economic power, and cultural influence. Roads crisscrossed the empire, letting armies move fast, merchants trade goods, and messages travel like modern mail, all while the Senate and emperors kept up the illusion of order. At this point, Rome felt unstoppable, and even distant provinces felt connected to the heartbeat of the capital. Military strength was the backbone. Legions were disciplined, heavily armed, and stationed strategically across borders to deter invasions and suppress rebellions. Soldiers were more than fighters. They were administrators, builders, and enforcers of law, keeping order in far-off provinces. Every victory, every fort, every road reinforced Rome's presence, sending the message that resisting the empire wasn't worth it. Generals and emperors leveraged this to maintain control while keeping the illusion of peace. Rome had mastered the art of projecting power without needing to be everywhere physically at once. Economically, Rome was thriving. Trade flowed across the Mediterranean like a river of gold, silver, grain, wine, olive oil, and exotic goods. Cities buzzed with markets, artisans worked in workshops, and provinces sent taxes to feed Rome's enormous bureaucracy and army. Wealth wasn't just concentrated in the elite. Citizens received grain distributions, entertainment, and civic services that made the empire feel prosperous and stable. This sense of abundance created loyalty and made rebellion less appealing, even in distant lands. Rome wasn't just powerful, it was practical in keeping people invested in the system.
Culturally, Rome dominated.
Latin language, Roman law, art, architecture, and religion spread across conquered lands, creating a shared identity that bound the empire together. Temples, amphitheaters, aqueducts, and public baths were everywhere, symbolizing both power and civilization. Citizens in Gaul, Hispania, or Syria could feel Roman, even if they weren't born in Rome itself. That cultural cohesion was one of the empire's secret weapons. People weren't just governed. They were socialized into the Roman way of life. Politically, emperors and the administration mastered the balance between fear and incentive. They maintained loyalty through rewards, spectacle, and governance while keeping the army satisfied and elites aligned. By this stage, the system felt eternal. Emperors could rule for decades, and citizens largely accepted the hierarchy because it delivered stability, safety, and prosperity. Rome at its peak wasn't just about brute force, it was about smart, layered control across politics, economy, culture, and military power. Yet, beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming. Borders were enormous and expensive to defend, inequality was growing, and local problems sometimes went unaddressed. Still, in terms of sheer scale, confidence, and the ability to influence every corner of the known world, Rome had never been stronger. The empire at this point looked eternal, and the world had never seen anything like it. Citizens and enemies alike marveled at its power. It was the peak of Rome's influence, the golden era of empire, and a high-water mark for civilization itself. Even at its peak, Rome had a ticking clock hidden beneath all the marble, roads, and triumphs. By the late empire, cracks were showing everywhere, and slow decline was setting in like a storm no one could fully stop. Economically, the system was stressed to the max tax, revenue struggled to cover the massive military and bureaucratic costs, inflation soared, and reliance on slave labor slowed innovation. Provinces far from the capital sometimes couldn't send taxes on time. Soldiers were underpaid or overworked, and elites hoarded wealth while everyday citizens felt the pinch. Money problems weren't just numbers on a ledger. They were shaking loyalty and increasing unrest across the empire. Borders were another nightmare. The empire was huge, but maintaining walls, fortifications, and legions in every corner was insanely expensive. Germanic tribes, Parthians, and other groups tested defenses constantly. Rome couldn't be everywhere at once, and that meant threats could grow quietly until they became crises. Local governors sometimes acted independently, the military loyalty shifted, and civil wars flared over succession disputes or regional grievances. What looked like a stable empire on the map was actually under constant pressure behind the scenes. Political instability was another killer. Emperors rose and fell faster than ever, often murdered, deposed, or overthrown by ambitious generals or scheming elites. Civil wars became recurring events rather than rare disasters, draining resources, demoralizing soldiers, and confusing the citizenry. The Senate existed, but it had become mostly symbolic, powerless to enforce laws or stabilize the state. Leadership churn made long-term planning nearly impossible, and the sense that anyone could claim power at any time eroded trust in the system. Society itself was strained. Inequality had grown huge. Rich elites flaunted wealth while ordinary citizens struggled with rising prices, food shortages, and overcrowded cities. Urban decay, corruption, and crime were growing problems. People started relying more on the central government's grain dole and entertainment to survive and cope. Civic pride and participation declined, and with that, the glue holding Rome together started to weaken. Citizens could still cheer at games and watch monuments, but deep down, loyalty to the empire was starting to feel like a transaction rather than identity. Even culture and religion, which once united the empire, began to shift. Pagan traditions were losing influence in some areas, new ideas and faiths spread, and the shared sense of what it meant to be Roman was less cohesive than ever. Local identities grew stronger, sometimes conflicting with the imperial system. The empire's strength wasn't disappearing overnight, but the foundations were slowly crumbling, and Rome's leaders were often blind to the warning signs. Aight fam, if you vibed with this one, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you ain't already, and share this video with your squad so everyone knows the real Roman story. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me who's your favorite Roman boss or which part blew your mind. Part 2 is coming soon. So stay tuned, we're diving even deeper, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's next. Peace. Victory hand.